This is Ed Chapman, and this is part 2 of the videocast series on respiration. And in this videocast, we're going to focus on electron carriers and the electron transport chain. First of all, let's back up a little bit and remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about the side of metabolism called catabolism that breaks things down generally to release energy and monomers for use in building things. And two molecules that are frequently broken down for energy, they're a big part of our food, are sugars like glucose and fatty acids, which of course are part of lipids. And these two molecules are rich in carbon-to-carbon bonds. So they have lots and lots of carbon-to-carbon bonds, and they have lots of carbon-to-hydrogen bonds. And these bonds are relatively high in energy, and this energy can be extracted in a process called oxidation. Remember, oxidation is taking away electrons and leaving behind a waste product, which we can call carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, of course, has no carbon-to-carbon bonds or carbon-to-hydrogen bonds. Carbon dioxide is just carbon double bonded to two oxygens. And these bonds here are low energy bonds. So we're pulling energy out of organic molecules. Living cells do this in small increments because whenever you release energy in large amounts, we call that explosions. And explosions tend to generate a lot of heat, and of course heat is pretty much useless for cells as something to do work with. So in order to harvest this energy in small pieces or small increments, molecules called electron carriers are used. And what electron carriers do is they pick up electrons and hold on to them long enough for the energy to be extracted in small chunks, so to speak. And these electron carriers then pass the electrons to a chain of proteins called an electron transport chain, or an ETC. So sometimes you'll see electron transport chains abbreviated as an ETC. And the most common electron carrier that we're going to talk about in connection to respiration is something called NAD, or NAD+, and that's going to be the electron carrier we're going to focus on today. All right, remember, when you add electrons to something, you reduce it. So what's going on basically is NAD+ is going to get some electrons. It's going to gain some electrons and be reduced. Remember, reduction is gain. So we're going to add 2 electrons to NAD, and these 2 electrons will then allow it to form bonds with, it's not 2, it's only 1, with a hydrogen, a proton here, a hydrogen ion. And so what you end up with is a molecule called NADH. And NADH is the oxidized form. You can think of NADH as a carrier in a football game, or I'm not a sports person here, but I think this person may be called a receiver. So once this guy gets hold of the little electron football, we can now say that his name changes to NADH. I don't know if that helped or not, but maybe to help some of you. All right. What's going on with glucose is being oxidized. That's where the electrons are coming from. So overall, we have a energy releasing, okay, delta G here is negative. We're releasing energy from glucose because glucose is being oxidized. Remember, oxidation is loss, okay? And what's left over after the complete oxidation of one glucose molecule is going to be 6 carbon dioxides. So we've got a major release of energy here, followed by the reduction or the picking up of these electrons by NAD+. So NAD+ is being reduced. Okay, so in the opposite direction, wait for it. Okay, in the opposite direction, we are pushing NAD uphill in an endergonic reaction to form an electron carrier that's now full of electrons. So the energy is coming from the oxidation of glucose, and it's being captured by the reduction of NAD+. All right. Now, remember, the second law means there's always going to be an inequality here. The free energy difference between glucose and the NADH you make is pretty great, and that's the energy that's being lost as heat. It's never a complete transfer, okay, or a completely equal transfer. So what happens to the NADH? Okay, remember NADH is kind of like a football player with the electrons. Okay, so this guy's got the electrons. So here's NADH. And what happens is NADH is going to be feeding its electrons into something called an electron transport chain. So this is the electron transport chain. And it's a series of membrane proteins embedded in the membranes of mitochondria, basically. And what they do is they're going to be passing electrons from one to the other downhill, so to speak. So the delta G is negative as these electrons move downhill. So they're giving up their energy as they head towards the bottom where there is a molecule of oxygen waiting. Now oxygen, of course, is diatomic, it's O2, but think of it as like a half of an O2 molecule. So it's just one oxygen. I've got a little animation here that'll show you how this works. Okay, so the electrons move downhill, okay, towards the oxygen, and the NADH, when it loses its electrons, the hydrogen ions are now free to move around, so they move towards the oxygen, and oxygen plus hydrogen plus the electrons that bond them together is going to give you water. So the electron transport chain is basically powered by the movement of electrons, and the electrons are moved because they're being pulled towards an oxygen at the bottom. Okay, so the key to the whole thing is the presence of oxygen down here, and this is why we need to breathe. All right, your mitochondria constantly need a new supply of oxygen to suck up these electrons and keep opening up space in your electron transport chains so more electrons can be fed downhill. All right, now we haven't made any ATP yet, so where does the ATP come from? Well, as the electrons flow downhill, the energy from this flow is used to reduce ADP to ATP. All right, so we're actually pushing ADP uphill to ATP by adding a phosphate group. So, of course, you have to add an inorganic phosphate to this to change the di to tri. So now we have a 3-phosphate molecule that came from originally a 2-phosphate molecule. And remember, in an ATP molecule, okay, the energy that we're adding here is the energy stored in that covalent bond between the last phosphate group. So it's the phosphate group, a phosphate group. The energy holding the last one on, okay, which we just put on here, that energy is coming from these electrons that are falling downhill through the electron transport chain. All right, we're going to stop there, and part 3 we'll pick up talking about what happens in fermentation or aerobic respiration. I think we're going to do aerobic respiration first, and what, how do you get... No, I'm sorry. The third part's going to cover glycolysis, so you'll have to wait to see that. Thanks for listening.